My name is Tim Stover, and on behalf of the Oregon State University School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, as well as on behalf of the members of our planning team and our sponsors, I welcome you to this final event within our 29th annual Holocaust Memorial observance here at Oregon State. The presentation this night features what has become known as our survivor speaker, in that Thomas Buergenthal is a survivor of the Nazi extermination complex at Auschwitz-Birkenau, as well as the camp at Sachsenhausen. Judge Buergenthal also comes to us as a renowned legal scholar. Before I continue with the introduction, I have a couple of housekeeping things I'd like to take care of. Those of you who are students here, or you're taking classes where you need to sign in for extra credit, out by the front doors you'll find a display which commemorates the 29 years of the history of this program on campus. You'll also find sign-in sheets there where you may sign in following the presentation. And also out in the lobby you will find the new edition of Thomas Buergenthal's memoir, A Lucky Child, available for sale. And following the presentation, we have microphones at the head of each aisle here. We will have time for a question and answer, and if you have a question, we ask that you please come forward. It's our experience that there may be a line, and we will alternate back and forth between microphones. So, A Lucky Child. This title to the memoir relates to a time in Thomas's early childhood as his family was seeking refuge from the growing threat of Nazi Germany's purging of Jews. While staying in the community of Katowice, Poland, Thomas's mother joined a friend in what was a somewhat surreptitious visit to a local fortune teller. His mother seemed surprised by how much the fortune teller seemed to know about her, having removed her wedding ring so that that wouldn't even be a clue. But the fortune teller knew not only that she was married, but that she also had a son. And the fortune teller announced that her son, Thomas, was a lucky child, and that he would emerge unscathed from the future that awaited them. And this promise was an abiding source of hope for Thomas's mother through all that they endured. And the fortune teller was mostly right in that we do have Thomas with us this night. And he was lucky in that both by luck, as well as by his father's and his own wit, and the improbable generosity of some fellow prisoners and prison staff even, he beat the great odds stacked against him as a young child in that selective system of death and annihilation. Our global community is also lucky in that out of the horror, the brutality, and the trauma of his early journey, Professor Buergenthal found a calling as an attorney who would dedicate his life to assuring justice for all through his work and his leadership in international human rights law. He currently serves as a Lobingier professor of comparative law and jurisprudence at George Washington University School of Law. He has previously served as a judge on several international courts and tribunals dealing with international human rights violations, including in Honduras and El Salvador here in the Americas, as well as being an American judge appointed to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. He is also the recipient of many awards honoring his work and leadership on behalf of human rights, including just this past week when he was recognized by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum as their 2015 recipient of the Elie Weisel Award for his service as an internationally prominent individual whose actions have advanced the museum's vision of a world where people confront hatred, prevent genocide, and promote human dignity. And finally, we are also lucky this night with the opportunity to welcome both the witness and the wisdom of this extraordinary and lucky man as he shares his vision for our shared journey from a world of fear toward a world of hope. So will you please join me in offering a warm OSU welcome for Judge Thomas Buergenthal.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. First, a disclaimer. I am not an expert on genocide or on the Holocaust. I'm just one of the victims, so I can speak from that perspective. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to see so many of you here. It was quite a job to get here. From Washington, D.C. I didn't realize how far it was. My wife said today, if you'd known, would you have come? But it's great to be here and to see so many of you interested in the topic that we're going to be discussing today. First of all, let me point out something. This is a very special day and week for me. This is the 70th anniversary of my liberation from the camp in Sachsenhausen. Actually, I don't know, and the scholars disagree whether it was the 21st of April or the 22nd of April, 1945, that this concentration camp of Sachsenhausen was liberated. All I know is that suddenly the machine gun disappeared, and a few hours later, Soviet troops came in and said we were free and opened the gate. The problem was that I was alone and I didn't know where to go. I was alone in the camp. Eventually, I found my way to the Polish army, and at the age of not quite 11, I became a mascot of the Polish army that was fighting with the Soviets. And when I am in Germany, I always point out that I helped liberate Berlin in the process. Anyway, I could go on and tell you a lot of things about my own experience in the Holocaust, but I think so many of you have read it. And Elie Weisel once said that if you heard one story, you probably have heard them all in terms of what went on. But there are two things, or three things, that stand out in my own mind in terms of my experience. And I'm not going to be speaking only about my experience. I've gotten strict instruction from Paul about what I'm supposed to be speaking about, so I'll stick to it. Those of you who know him know that you listen when he speaks. I should tell you, first of all, one of my experiences that's always going to be with me is the death march out of Auschwitz. When Soviet troops were approaching Auschwitz, the SS decided to take us with them to Germany. And they marched us, this was in January of 1945, they marched us for 3 days in Polish winter. And those of you who know something about Polish winters will know what that means. And what it meant, among other things, that if you sat down because you could no longer walk, you were just shot right there on the spot and body pushed into the ditch. And when I think about it now, to have survived this, when I went back with my wife to Auschwitz, also in January, in a heavy, heavy coat, I was freezing and I couldn't, and I thought back, and I just had a very thin little present garb and a blanket. And I survived that 3-day march, and then 10 days on open cars, railroad cars, going to Sachsenhausen. And then eventually I would say about half of the people who were with us on the train died. And when we asked the SS, what do we do with the dead? Throw them overboard. The other experience that is worth mentioning, just so that you get that the Holocaust is not something that is today just written in a few books, but it's a reality that so many of us suffered and didn't survive. My mother survived, and my mother found me 2 years after we were separated. She never gave up. And she didn't give up also because of what the fortune teller told her, even though afterwards I said, did you believe that? Oh no, that was hocus pocus. But she believed it, and that's what sustained her. So let me mention another one, experience in the camp, and then I will not give you any more gruesome stories. But something that is also, there are many things that have stayed with me after all of those years, 70 years. In the work camp where we were before we went to Auschwitz, there was an escape by young people in our group. And they were caught, beaten terribly, and then ordered to be hanged. And what they did was they not only hanged them in front of us, but they picked their friends to do the hanging. And you could see one of the boys had to put the rope over his head, and his hands were shaking. And this fellow who was condemned just put his hand through and kissed the hand of his executioner in many ways. Something I've never forgotten and will never forget. So those are just a few things. There are many more such things that I troubled my children with when they were young, and no wonder they didn't like to listen to me. I was told also, Paul is the one who told me what to speak about today, to speak about my career in international law. When I came to the United States in 1951 at the age of 17, and I had very little schooling. I only had about 2.5 years of school before I came to the US, and 1 year of private tutoring in Germany. I managed to go to high school in Patterson, New Jersey, finished in 1.5 years, and then went to the only college that would give me a scholarship. Was Bethany College in West Virginia, Disciples of Christ school, which I've never forgotten. Then I went on to NYU for a law degree, and then to Harvard for specializing both in international law, both as a Master of Law and a Doctor in Juridical Science in international law. So I'm an international lawyer. I am a Holocaust survivor just on the side. But my experience really is in international law. And I specialized gradually, actually, in international human rights. I felt that those of us who survived had some obligation to see that the things that happened to us weren't repeated on other people in other parts of the world, and I wanted to see how one could do this. I still don't know how you do it, but it's something that we should have a commitment to try to prevent these things from happening, and that is really what I've spent my professional life doing. I was very fortunate in some ways, because when I first started in the human rights field, international human rights field, nobody was very much interested in it. And I should also tell you that when I came to the United States, nobody was interested in hearing anything about the Holocaust. You'll be surprised to hear it's not only non-Jews, but Jews weren't interested in it either. This came much later. Which surprised me when I came to this country. The Germans, where I went to school, were very preoccupied with it. They didn't dare ask questions. They wanted to. Here, they just It was total silence, and I've still never understood it. In part, I think, and have to be forgiven for thinking that the Jewish community in the United States had a little bad conscience, that they didn't help us more with visas that were necessary, that weren't gotten. To get back to why I was also fortunate in my field, human rights was not something anybody was interested in. I had a wonderful professor at Harvard. We wrote the first American law school casebook on international human rights together. And up to then, only 3 people in the United States taught the course in American law schools. Then we provided them with a book. And today, there's hardly a major law school in this country that doesn't teach international human rights. It surprised us because the book was selling more every year, which is something publishers tell you is not the case. The advantage of being one of the few people in this field was that when the State Department needed somebody to deal with the subject, they turned to who is the guy who knows something about human rights? So my first sort of assignment was to represent the US at UNESCO on international human rights issues. From there, gradually, I always taught human rights. I actually, at one point, and I'll skip, I was teaching at the University of Texas in Austin, a seminar on human rights, and I kept telling my students, since the US has not ratified the Convention on the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, no American is ever going to serve on the court established under that convention. And I kept repeating it. Until one day the telephone rings in my office, and somebody in a sort of Latin American accent says to me, I'm calling as ambassador of Costa Rica to Washington, D.C., because our government would be honored if you would accept a nomination of Costa Rica to the newly established Inter-American Court of Human Rights. I was sure it was one of my students goofing around. And I was so sure that I said, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, but I think I can't just accept it. I need to speak to my family. And would you please leave me your telephone number? And of course, as soon as he hung up, I checked, and it was really the embassy of Costa Rica. That's how I ended up on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and I'll tell you much more about it in a minute. And from there on, I ended up on a number of interesting assignments, both as a member of the Truth Commission in El Salvador, for the United Nations Truth Commission in El Salvador, the UN Human Rights Committee, and some other activities, and eventually ended up as the US judge on the International Court of Justice, which is sort of the ultimate for any international lawyer. But we actually did very little human rights work. And my wife and I, after 10 years there, decided to come home, that the grandchildren were more important. But the real work that I did in the human rights area was on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, where we decided the first ever disappearance case decided by an international court. Disappearances, there were about 200 disappearances in Honduras, and we decided 3 of those cases. And it became sort of the classic case of how you deal with disappearances in international law when you're confronted with this. The reason it was such a complicated case, because disappearances are inventions by governments, where they disappear you and kill you and torture you, but they don't identify themselves as being the government. So it's very difficult then to accuse a government of a disappearance, because they say we had nothing to do with it. He probably told his wife that he was going to buy some cigarettes, and then he joined the guerrillas or he went out and joined his girlfriend. And those were the type of cases one had to deal with. And how do you, from a legal point of view, find a valid basis to confront this sort of defense? So this was one of the important cases we had in the Inter-American Court. What I should tell you about it was a strange case, strange court to be established. It was established, we were there for the first judges. In 1979, when most of Latin America was really run by dictatorial regimes, military regimes, dictators of all ilk. And within that environment, to establish an international human rights court and have success was quite an effort. And I've always thought that that was one of the things that I'm most proud of, to have served on that court and have had this opportunity to actually make it possible in the region for people to speak about human rights, which at one point was quite dangerous. And suddenly there was a court in Costa Rica, an international court, that made it possible for people to say we have human rights, and they're guaranteed by the American Convention on Human Rights. I served on that court for 2 6-year terms, and a year later I was asked by the United Nations to serve on the Truth Commission for El Salvador, the United Nations Truth Commission for El Salvador. This was at the end of the 12-year war that was fought at El Salvador. The killings were unbelievable. A small country where sometimes families were fighting on one side or the other. My worst experience there was, or not worse, but just brought back my concentration camp experience, was there was a massacre called the El Mozote Massacre in El Salvador, where between 500 to 700 women, children, and old people were just massacred by the government forces. There was one survivor. And when she started to speak about what was happening, we were interviewing her. After about 2 minutes of listening to her, I felt I could finish what she was saying. It was the same sort of experience we had in the ghetto of Kielce when they began the liquidation of the ghetto with the shooting and killing and anybody who was running in which direction. And similar things, for example, being in the place where the 7 Jesuit priests were murdered and seeing something which I've never forgotten. We walked into the house led by another Jesuit who was very lucky not to have been there at the moment, and he showed us a portrait of Archbishop Romero with a hole in the portrait. The soldiers who came in to execute the Jesuits wanted to also, the Archbishop had already been killed a few years earlier, but they wanted to show their disdain and disrespect for the Archbishop, so they had to put another bullet into the portrait of an Archbishop who was a wonderful man and had fought very hard to try to save lives in that environment. There are many, and I should tell you that it wasn't only one side, the government side, that committed many of these offenses. It was also the other side. And what we did, there were 3 of us on this commission, the former president of Colombia, President Betancourt, a former foreign minister of Venezuela, and I. And we decided that we would name names of individuals we found had committed these offenses. And there was a big campaign first started to prevent us from naming names. As soon as the report came out with names, the government decided to have an amnesty for everybody we had identified, but not only. It was an amnesty for both sides. And both sides, and this is when you have criminals fighting each other for whatever reason decided to amnesty each other. But the names were out. So they couldn't have been tried, but everybody finally knew who they were. It wasn't just rumors, but an international commission had identified them, which to this day, unfortunately, there's a lot of common crime in El Salvador, but the political crime is no longer there, and many of these people, it's known who they were. Recently, the United States finally deported one of the generals who was very, very active and had identified himself as a great friend of the United States, and that's why he was entitled to be protected, even though he was one of those who had committed and ordered the commission of many, many crimes. Now, I'm sure there are many, and I could go on, but you don't want to hear all of this. There are many skeptics, I'm sure, here. When you hear there are international treaties for the protection of human rights, there are international courts, and there's still, genocide is still being committed, and you say, what is it all worth? Let me tell you, it's worth it. It takes time. I was struck by it. Americans say, how come they haven't done this or that? Why haven't they stopped this terrible activity in one country or the other? Why has it taken us so long to do away with racial discrimination in this country? It takes time. So let me just give you a little lesson on what I teach in my classes about the existing international institutions and the skeptics whom I hate in my classes, because I think there's nothing worse than being skeptical about these things, because it's just an excuse for doing nothing. So, just a short lesson, and then I'll open it up to questions, and I hope to hear from you. I try to get you to ask questions. That's the only way I'm used to teaching international law, and so here you have the opportunity to teach an international lawyer to answer questions. We never answer questions in our classes, we only ask questions, which is much easier, let me tell you. Basically what we have today, and I won't go into all of the legal basics, we have, for example, in Europe, we have the European Convention of Human Rights, and we have a court that has existed since 1953. It's become basically the European Constitutional Court dealing with human rights matters. It's the first in the world. It's decided many, many cases, has held almost every government in Western and Eastern Europe responsible for some violations of human rights, including many governments who thought that they were the embodiment of human rights protection. Nevertheless, each government historically has something in the closet that they want to hide, and consequently it's come out. We now have an Inter-American Court on Human Rights on which I served, which really was a court that was modeled on the European Court of Human Rights. The problems that we had in Latin America were much more complicated than the problems Western Europe had when that court was first established. But it's doing some fascinating work today with many more cases. There is now a new African court which has the biggest problems. It's not easy to have a human rights tribunal in Africa, considering the problems they face, poverty, dictatorships, and everything else, but it exists. We have, the United Nations has adopted a large number of treaties, start with the Genocide Convention. We now have also the first ever, after Nuremberg, International Criminal Court, established in 2002. We've waited since Nuremberg for this court to be established, It's finally been established. It now has more than 130 member states. Unfortunately, not the United States, not Russia, not China, and a few other countries. We're always holdouts with some countries we really don't want to be identified. But here we are. The United States, incidentally, never ratified the American Convention on Human Rights. So when I was elected to the court, I was the only American elected, and no American has ever been elected to that court again. Because the US couldn't nominate, Costa Rica wanted to nominate me, and they said, that's the last time an American will serve on that court until the United States ratifies the convention. We're still waiting. There are two courts that have been extremely active, so-called ad hoc international criminal tribunals, created after the Bosnian conflict, and another one created after Rwanda. These two ad hoc tribunals have tried quite a large number of people that are sitting now in jail. These were tribunals established that were supposed to last only 2 or 3 years. They have now still going, established in 1992, and they're still operating because it's such a difficult task. But really the international criminal law we now have has been created by these courts, and it's an impressive thing that is going on. Most Americans are totally unaware of the existence of these courts, both the Rwanda one and the Bosnia one. The Bosnia one sits in The Hague and has been, and it's still trying to wind down its activities, but every so often one more criminal is found. I probably should stop. I could go on, but what does my wife say? Do I continue? Take questions. My poor wife actually could have delivered my speech, but she doesn't want to. No, my wife was an interpreter in the court in Costa Rica, where we met. So she knows all about this stuff much more than I do. That's why I always ask for her opinion. But there's so many of you here who have questions. Some of you are sitting as far away as my students like to sit. But feel free to ask any question about anything I covered or didn't cover. And if I don't know the answer, I'll tell you. It'll take a few minutes, if you don't mind. When I came to the US, I went to high school in New Jersey. There was a counselor, a college counselor, to whom I went and told her I wanted to go to college and what she could tell me how you go about doing that. So she taught me, and then she gave me a list of 10 colleges to which I should apply. And she said, it's important for you to apply to small schools in the US. That'll be the easy way for you to get acclimated. And there were some of the well-known small colleges on the East Coast. I wrote to all 10 for the catalog, and I completed the application to only 9. I was admitted, but they all said that because of my they had another name for it, educational background, they would admit it, but they would only give me a scholarship after I proved myself in the first year. Well, I didn't have the funds to do that. And I didn't apply to Bethany College because when I opened the book, it said, this is a Christian college. And coming from Europe, I figured that they did not accept Jews. They would not have anything to do with Jews. And so I was at that point thinking, what am I going to do? I have to work in a factory and get money for the first year. When I get called to the office of the counselor, and she introduces me to the Dean of Students of Bethany College. And he says, "Young man, why didn't you apply? We noticed that you asked for the catalog." And I said, well, it was not all that easy to give the reason. And finally I said, well, I saw that you were a Christian college and you probably didn't want me. "Young man, you're in America," he said. And he said, you apply and you'll have a scholarship and work. And that was it. I went to Bethany College, and I've never regretted it. It was just the right thing for me to be in that college. And I was treated well is an understatement, really. It was a wonderful experience for me. I think that answers your question. That's one of those questions that I was afraid of getting from students. Well, first of all, one of the most important things is to familiarize yourself with what is available to do. For example, there are a lot of non-governmental organizations in the United States and also abroad who work in those different fields and work in different countries. Find out what they are doing, what they suggest should be done. But to me also the most important thing is for American students to find out more about the possibilities. For example, what treaties exist. That's not too complicated legally, and begin to see what they do, what kind of access one is provided for outsiders to have an impact. And the other thing is to organize. Even more and more non-governmental organizations arise from a group of students getting together and deciding to pick one country, for example, publicize what's going on in that country, and work that way. There are many, many opportunities. But the best thing for starters, I would just draw up a list of some of the American and international NGOs that work. All of you know Amnesty International, but there are many, many others. Many very good ones in the United States, America's Watch and other watch committees, for example. Human Rights First, another one, American one. And see what they're doing and whether what you could do working with them. And there's much more.
Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, it'll surprise you that there aren't all that many defined countries when they're accused. And let me explain why. Stay with me. I don't like questions that run away from me. You pointed out quite correctly that there are countries who've agreed. Usually when countries agree to subscribe to some international contract, international treaty, to work with an international court, they've made a political decision of the possible consequences. That is to say, they know that they didn't have to do it. Countries are free. There is no to ratify or not to ratify an international agreement that has a court. So for a country to agree to subscribe to an international agreement that establishes a court, they will have made a political decision of taking the consequences. So most of the time, they will accept an adverse decision. Not always. But if you think, for example, of the International Court of Justice, in the 70 years of its existence, there have been only 5 countries that haven't complied with its judgment, and one is the United States. Other countries feel that they've made a decision and they have to comply. And that is true of many, many instances. I'm not denying that there are some countries that don't comply. On the other hand, what happens very often is that a country will not comply for a while. And then there is a change of government in that country, and then they will comply. So the assumption is that, you know, they were just going to say, we sign up, but we don't have to comply. It's not true. It's a problem sometimes. It's a real problem to encourage others. And it becomes a real problem when a country like the United States does not comply. Well, what happened in the case, for example, I sat on 2 cases, for example, involving the United States and the International Court of Justice. One case in which 53 Mexicans were on death row in the United States. The United States and Mexico have treaty obligations that require the United States to advise every Mexican national that he or she has a right to access the consul of that country when arrested. None of the 53 were ever advised that they had that right. By the time they were convicted, they had already some lawyers, but it was too late under US law to invoke the treaty. There's something called procedural default in US jurisprudence. And so Mexico took the cases to the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice held that the United States had violated the treaty and asked the United States to have the United States courts determine whether or not there was prejudice for these 53, whether they were prejudiced because they did not get the rights that they were entitled to. Some US individual states acted on this, but most of them didn't. But then, curiously enough, the president disordered it, and then the Supreme Court held that the president did not have the power to order it, but that it was up to the Congress. And now, more than 10, 12 years later, no action has been taken by Congress. Now, we have a dysfunctional Congress, and it's not the only thing that's going wrong. But that's something that we laugh about because we know what else the Congress isn't doing. But in other countries, it looks terribly like saying the US is just not complying with its international obligations. That's another one of those questions. Well, you know, first of all, I think what is so important is to study what's going on in the world, to study. You're in college. You've got tremendous opportunities. And most of us never really take all the opportunity. You have a great library, a lot of possibilities. The first thing to do with these 4 years that you have here is to familiarize yourself with the world. And at that point, decide what you really think is important. And each one of you may very well have different goals in terms of what is important to you after you've familiarized yourself with it. But the most important starting point is to learn more. And so often, you know, when we're in college, we think, oh, we're going to do this or that, but we don't really know enough about it. So my advice to you, for example, is take advantage of the library, find out what's going on in the world, and then decide what you feel needs to be done. Don't get an old man to tell you what you need to do. But really, and you will be surprised what you find. There's so many opportunities to do important things that you would enjoy doing if you just knew that they were available.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you coming.
Thank you. Thank you. The question is how. I know there's a differentiation in the Genocide Convention. Rather, genocide, to be genocide, requires 2 intentions. One, the intent to commit a crime, and the specific intent to commit genocide, which is a crime involving ethnic, religious, or ethnic killings. But there is a total other number of crimes, like, for example, crime against humanity, which isn't genocide because it is just a large-scale international criminal offense. And there is a general sort of assumption among international lawyers and among the public at large that the worst possible crime is genocide. I think we're exaggerating that. This is my personal view. I think a serious crime against humanity is every which as bad as genocide. And one of the problems is, for example, that genocide is defined in many ways, but it does not define political opinion as a basis for your killing. And that is something that I think is very missing, and it is missing because the Soviets tried to keep it out of the Genocide Convention. So, to my mind, and I've been connected with the US Holocaust Museum for a long time as chairman of a committee that dealt with the subject, I always speak of genocide and related crimes. So the related crimes to me are crimes against humanity, massive crimes that are every which, to me, as important as genocide itself. It doesn't mean that genocide isn't very, very important, but let's not forget the other killings. For example, what is happening today in North Korea is not genocide. It's a crime against humanity of the most unbelievable type, but it doesn't really qualify as genocide. Does that help? The second part. Well, any killing, murder, mass murder, that is intended to eradicate that particular ethnic group would be genocide. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not also a crime against humanity. So you have your choice. But if it involves another group and they're going after them because they're Muslims, for example, and they want to eradicate that group and destroy that group, that would be genocide. Let me tell you, first of all, if I may, your question is so good that it gets me to say things that I would have liked to have said when we were speaking. First of all, I went back to Auschwitz for the first time with my wife. I was beginning to think of writing my book, my memoir. I didn't know precisely when I got to Auschwitz. I knew the year and I knew the month, but I didn't know the date, and I didn't know how many people came with me. So, at the urging of my wife, and the reason I emphasize the urging, because even though I was there, I didn't want to do anything else but just walk through it because I was afraid it would really affect me. But she said, well, look, there is the archive. Why don't you go in, say who you are, and maybe they will provide you the information. Well, I walked in, and I told them that I was a survivor, and I gave them my name. And I said, I'd like to know when I arrived. And the lady said to me, you know, when you arrived in Auschwitz, this was in 1944, the Germans no longer wrote down names. They only had numbers. So give us your number. So I pulled up my sleeve, I gave her my number. She immediately told me when I arrived, how many people were in the transport, where we came from. What struck me at that moment was that if I had died in Auschwitz, would never have existed. So all the people who died in Auschwitz, roughly the same time I came, didn't exist. The indignity of it, to me, was so horrendous of what was happening there. This big book, and we always thought the Germans were writing everything down. No, just a number. And many, many people died. The whole group, Hungarian Jews who came during that period, didn't exist. So now, after telling you this, I forgot your question. No, I tell you, my closure didn't come until very recently. It didn't come in Auschwitz because when I was there and walking through, it was in part reliving a lot of things and not trying to break down. So it was sort of an attempt to not really being there. But I felt I had, and then worrying at the same time that if I saw it, it would affect my memory of what it was like, because it was very different. Most of the barracks in Birkenau were destroyed after the war. So there was a problem for me of orientation. Where was my camp at that time? So that wasn't the case. My closure came not long ago when I discovered documents relating to my mother's 2-year search for me. Unbelievable documents, which are reproduced now in the book, in the second edition of the book, and also documents about my father's last days. He died in Buergenthal in January of 1945, 3 months before the end of the war. And publishing that to me brought closure in terms of what all of this meant to my family, but not going through Auschwitz. And this recent, as you know, the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, I didn't go. If I go to Auschwitz, I want to go there with my wife alone and think about it. But it's a wonderful question, and thank you so much. You allowed me to say things I hadn't planned to say.
We have one here, Phil.
Yes, please. I am aware of that, yes.
Well, I'd like to know if there's any action stuff.
First of all, this is a very important issue in Mexico, because there were young people, students, who were turned over by the military, apparently, to the narcos, who then killed them. And the mayor of that particular town was the one who in fact engineered that terrible crime, and the bodies have never been found, at least not up to now, as far as I know. I really don't have an answer in terms of whether the case has been submitted, but there is action inside of Mexico to try to bring that first to the Mexican courts, because in order for a case to be brought to an international court, you have to have an exhaustion of domestic remedies. So the procedure is it has to go before Mexican court. I know what your answer would be, but whatever is determined by the domestic court, then it can go to an international court, and they can determine whether or not the Mexican government, the Mexican courts acted in accordance with the international obligations they have assumed. But it's a terrible case, and in many ways it's probably not the first time this has happened in Mexico.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, wonderful that you probably heard that I just got the Elie Weisel Award. Elie Weisel and I served together on the committee that President Carter appointed to decide what kind of steps should be taken in the United States to remember the Holocaust. And the museum is the outcome of that deliberation at the committee. During one of those meetings we had, Elie Weisel said to me, you know, we were on the death march together. We didn't know each other. He didn't know me and I didn't know him, but we knew where we were. Elie Weisel, so I've known him for a long time, and he actually wrote the preface to my book. And I should tell you, I've never read his book. I don't read any Holocaust books. I can't. I also cannot see any Holocaust movies or plays. Sometimes there's a movie that somebody recommends we go and see. My wife goes first to see whether it's something I can see. But Elie Weisel really was the first one who wrote about it in the United States and was very significant in the creation of the Holocaust Museum. I should tell you that I opposed the establishment of the Holocaust Museum in the United States, and I'm glad they didn't pay attention to what I was saying. My reason was that I've said, this was during the Carter administration, I said if we're going to build Holocaust museums, they should be first in Germany. And at that time, there was nothing in Germany yet. Then, when I served I was appointed to the Council of the Holocaust Museum and chaired the Committee on Conscience. When I saw all of the children lining up every morning to go and see the museum and see the cadets from U.S. What are they called? The U.S. Training schools for military, seeing the museum and seeing how they reacted when they went into the museum, I said, I think the pedagogic value of what the Holocaust Museum performs was worth establishing it. And it said, it's now millions and millions of people have come in and seen what happened. And so I'm delighted they didn't listen to me. In the meantime, Germany has built many of the things that I thought Germany should have done. So, mea culpa. But fortunately, nobody listened to me. You know, when I first came out of the camp, and I mentioned it in my book, when I was reunited with my mother, we lived in a house with a balcony. And on weekends, German families in the old German tradition would walk into the forest, up to the hill, past us. And I kept saying to my mother, I wish I had a machine gun to kill them like they killed my father and my grandparents. And then gradually I began to think about it, and I had a friend from the concentration camp, a Norwegian, who was there for different reasons. He published a book in Germany, a diary of his experience in Sachsenhausen, a book that was partially dedicated to me, and published it in Norwegian, also in English and in German. And he gave all of the proceeds of his book to German refugees. And he'd spent 3 years in the German camps. And I said to them, why would you do this? These are the guys who did this all to us. And we had then a number of long discussions. And his basic point was that hate begets hate. And we have to, if we want to stop these killings, we have to stop hating. And I thought about it and thought about it. And it affected my total attitude to it. I don't hate Germany. Incidentally, Germany today is a very different Germany. So that discussion has had a tremendous impact of my thinking about how you confront these activities. This man, incidentally, had saved my life in Sachsenhausen. So to me, this was an eye-opener, and I wish many people who've had my experience or who have similar experiences in other genocides have somebody who can talk to them the way I was talked to, and to stop hatred, because it doesn't do any good. It hurts us internally. It has terrible consequences. That's my answer to the first part of your question. Well, I think there's always some bias in one way or the other. But many of the non-governmental organizations, human rights non-governmental organizations, are funded by important foundations who examine whether they have biases or not. And they provide information of what is going on. I should tell you that when I served, for example, on the UN Human Rights Committee, the governments would have to submit reports every 4 years on what they were doing. And we on the committee couldn't really necessarily examine what was happening in that country or find that they... So the NGOs would do counter reports of different countries, and they would present us these reports, even though there's no provision in the procedures of the committee to receive this information, but they would just pass it to us. And then I would have in front of me, when examining the government representative, what I thought were objective reports on what was really happening in the country, and not what the government was saying. So many of these organizations, these NGOs, provide tremendously good service to organization committees like the one I served on, and provide valuable service. So I think, look at some of them. Look at human rights NGOs, for example, in the United States, the major ones, and you'll see that they are doing some excellent work, and they need help. And not only, they need people who could go to other countries and provide information about things. Languages are very important. Incidentally, all of your students, you want to do something in human rights, learn some languages. So, there's much more advice I can give you, but I'll keep it.
There's a lot going on, so it's hard to focus on one thing.
Yeah, but that would be one way to start. Take a look at it. By tomorrow morning, you'll be an expert. The Soviet Union. Why would I go to the Soviet Union? First of all, my uncle came to the United States in 1938, and my mother's brother. And I actually came for only 1 year. And I should tell you something about the United States. I criticize the United States, which I have every right to do, because this is the United States and not the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, I would be as quiet as everybody else used to be. When I was in Sachsenhausen, the last camp, the Germans had a very strange understanding of, they were trying to even propagandize us with the news. They had news broadcasts for us, and they would report what they wanted us to know and what the German population would also get. So we listened to all of these things, and for example, one of the news broadcasts was that Jew Roosevelt died today. And we had learned that whatever they told us, we had to reverse. So we figured Hitler had died. And everything was like this. And to get back to the United States, American and British bombers would fly over our camp, which was only 30 miles away from Berlin, with bombing. And when they flew over our camps, they dropped what is known as Christmas trees around the camp to protect the camp so that no bombs would be thrown into the camp. Now you know why And I dreamt as a child, my toes were amputated, part of my toes were amputated after that death march. I was lying in this bed, and the planes were flying over, and I had this dream and wish that one of these big planes would drop a hook and hook up my barrack and take it to America. Never thought of taking it to the Soviet Union. Well, let me tell you, I don't want to tell you gruesome things, well, you tell me afterwards whether I should continue. But one of the other things I was going to tell you in the beginning today when I talked about the hanging, for example. In the second camp where we were after the liquidation of the ghetto, where about 20,000 people were sent to Treblinka and were killed, including my grandparents. There were about 1,500 or maybe 2,000 of us who were not sent to Treblinka but were sent to another camp. And my parents and I were in that group because my father ran a workshop that was working for the Germans. They had tailors and shoemakers and others whom the Germans wanted to save. And so I was saved with them. And then one day they decided to liquidate that camp. And by liquidating that camp, what they had in mind first was to take all the children that were still there, about 40 of us, and liquidate them, basically. And they were starting to pull the children out from their hands of the parents. My mother had saved 2 smaller children, our neighbors' children, and they were immediately torn away from my mother. The parents of these 2 children had asked my mother save them and just handed them over while they went to Treblinka. And they were torn away from us and other kids. And imagine the picture. Here is standing the chief of police ordering his goons to pull the children away and screaming what everything is going on. And my father says to me, "Go to him and tell him you can work." And I was 9 years old, but I spoke German and I didn't look Jewish, at least the way he thought Jews should look. And I spoke to him in the German that his children probably spoke. And I said, "Herr Hauptmann, ich kann arbeiten." As captain, I can work. And he looked at me and he said, "Das wollen wir mal sehen. We'll want to see that." And he let me stay with my parents. You know what happened to the rest of the children? They were taken to the Jewish cemetery in Kielce and destroyed with hand grenades. I don't think I should tell you more stories like this. That was the sort of life we lived. And that's the reason I cannot see. I've been on the Holocaust Museum. I've never gone through the Holocaust Museum. I go to the meeting room on the 5th floor, but I can't go through it. I can't see all of these things that I have lived, and I can talk about them, but I can't see them. Again, would be to see them. So I think your daughter and others should imagine just how terrible it was for all of the people, for those who survived and for those who died. And we should work to make sure that that doesn't happen to any human beings, any place else in the world. What happened to us, unfortunately, a lot of it is still happening today. But we have to commit ourselves to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Should I do my father's thing? You should know, first of all, that in the camps, there were a lot of our own people who reported things to the Germans. And it was very, very dangerous to say things about Hitler or anything else. And sometimes, some remark made, somebody overheard you and they reported it because they got another piece of bread extra or something. Were terrible of those things. My father was one who couldn't live with that sort of life, and he would go something like this. He would imitate Hitler. Ein deutsches Volk! And my mother would say, "This is dangerous. You can't do this." So there were a lot of those. He would do this. So you had to survive in that environment, you had to be able also the people to tell jokes about things and to laugh about it. That was humor is something that is sometimes the best medicine when you're suffering. That's why the best political jokes have come out of the Soviet Union. And now they say, well, now they're beginning to have those jokes again. For a while they were still a totally free country, the jokes were stopping. Now they're coming again. I should tell you that was the hardest thing for me to write, the reunion. Maybe you should read my book. Because there were just a few moments in writing the book when I just had to stop and then start again. It wasn't easy. It was wonderful, but it wasn't easy. I'm being thrown out, so... Thank you all very much.